Before we get into this week's episode, I want to make a plug for Art Market Minute. This is Artnet News' new micro-podcast hosted by Margaret Kerrigan, who's the site's news editor Europe. It offers a weekly snapshot of essential art market news expertly compiled by the Artnet Pro editorial team.
It's a very good mix of different kinds of centers with different kind of focus, serving different levels of clientele and different tastes of collecting. It feels like, okay, now it's much more vibrant across Asia.
I'm Andrew Russeth, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast by Artnet News. At the start of September, a massive chunk of the international art world descended on South Korea for a bounty of high-profile art offerings. The marquee event was Frieze Seoul in its third edition at the COEX Convention Center in the Lux Gangnam District, running alongside the long-established Korea International Art Fair, KIAF. But they represented just one element of the action. All over Seoul, museums and galleries were opening big shows, angling for attention. Samsung's Leo Museum hosted an Annika Yi blowout and a superb exhibition of young artists curated by Rikrit Tirabanija. The beauty giant Amore Pacific welcomed Elm Green and Dragset at a museum in the basement of its David Chipperfield-designed headquarters, while Gagosian set up shop with a Derek Adams show on the ground floor up above. Local heavyweights came out swinging, PKM with the Korean modernist Yu Young-guk, Pace with the potent pairing of Yu Fan and Mark Rothko, and Jason Ham with Swiss sculptor Urs Fischer. Celebrities were everywhere, parties were everywhere, no one seemed to be sleeping, and everyone was on the move. And the festivities were not just confined to Seoul. The esteemed Gwangju Biennale inaugurated its 15th edition in that southern city the day after the fairs opened. It's a tough, sharp exhibition curated by the Frenchman Nicolas Borriaud, and it ran alongside more than 30 national pavilions in part of the city's bid to become the Venice of Asia. Along the country's southern coast, meanwhile, the latest Busan Biennale was also drawing crowd with more than 60 artists selected by its curators Vera and Philippe Pirotte. It too is a tough show, activist-minded, engaging, and we're going to get into it. There was so much happening that it was almost impossible to see it all. It was impossible to see it all, even if you had a dedicated driver, which many VIPs did, and even if you were willing to forego any moments of rest. And so I am very, very excited to be joined now by my colleague Vivienne Chow, who is based in London and who was on the ground in South Korea all of the stretch of the Korean Art Week. Vivienne, great to see you. We're back from Korea Art Week, which was really more like Korea Art Fortnight, 2 weeks. And I'm thinking we should just, for the listeners, dive into everything that happened. We had Frieze Seoul, we had KIAF, we had 2 Biennales, actually more than that, which we'll get into. But you hit the ground before me. And so do you want to maybe to start out just talk about what you saw and how you hit the ground running in Seoul?
Yeah, sure. I arrived on Saturday night and I noticed that a lot of people this time, people who were traveling from internationally, they were arriving much earlier than previously. I guess people had a feeling that because the events, they started so much earlier on, basically like a week before the fair opened. If you didn't go earlier in advance and you felt that there's this like FOMO effect that you felt like you kind of missed out something. So I think I arrived at the right time. There was some gallery openings on Saturday. I went to Jason Ham's opening. It was interesting because he has a beautiful gallery and he's also expanding the gallery and taking over the building just right next door. And it's kind of like an old rundown building. And they installed a very interesting show of Swiss artist Urs Fischer. It had a really good turnout, and I think the atmosphere was quite nice because people didn't feel the pressure because you're there, but then it seems like, oh, things haven't really started yet, but actually it already started. And then Sunday, a few more gallery events and dinners, and then Monday was a real in-action day. A lot of people started running around, and there are several events on Monday, as we covered in our report, because it's the art week and then the fashion week and also the blockchain week. So I think people, they just arrive in so much earlier so that they can plan things ahead, so that they can go to the art events, they can go see fashion shows, and then go to the blockchain week and maybe like give a couple of speeches there. But it all sounded really, really exciting when you have all these events happening at the same time. And interestingly, I think all these events, art, fashion, technology, they all gelled really well together. It felt like a huge convergence of all these different events, but then they kind of share similar people, maybe the resources, like crossover, collaboration. So it created this really great vibe. I don't know if you felt the same, Andrew.
Yeah, the city felt very alive in a really amazing way. The first Free Seoul was a little bit in pandemic mode. I mean, things had opened up a couple months before. The second one was bigger, but this one, I mean, you got to hand it to the Frieze organizers. It felt like the museums were rolling out the red carpet. The galleries had great shows on. The foundations had amazing shows. I mean, there was the Pinot collection at Sangun. There were every night. I mean, they'd done this in the past, but the crowds that you would see when you went to the neighborhood nights. So one night, everyone was in Samcheongdong in the northern part of the city. One night, everyone was in Itaewon and Hanam. And some of the galleries did cool stuff. Like Kukje during Samcheong night had just this giant spread of tables and chairs set up. And there were fish cakes and fried chicken and like 4 or 5 draft beer machines. And there must have been 1,000 people in that courtyard roaming around. And everyone was in very high spirits. And what you're saying about the fashion presence was interesting too. There were definitely, it felt like more fashion tie-ins. I mean, you wrote about the Chanel dinner. Pharrell was there for Vuitton stuff. Other brands like Porsche had this big exhibition and funny multifaceted thing with artists like Koo Jong-ah and Karsten Haller, who brought his restaurant from Stockholm. So it was really like everything. Food, art, fashion was happening in Seoul.
Yeah, definitely. So it was very exciting. Kukje night, it was really good fun, and we took pictures just next to that pile of chicken wings. I've never seen so many chicken wings piled up in my life.
A beautiful thing to see at an art fair, and so generous. I was just thinking, like, I just love New York, but I can't imagine a New York gallery opening up a party for like 1,000 people, all comers. I mean, they had their restaurant open, and it was gigantic. It was just a very convivial atmosphere. Really nice to see.
Yes, it was a great evening that night. And also the galleries, they opened until the party shut down. So that was almost midnight. And it was nice to be able to see the show as well, which was very important.
Yes. Yeah. No, great shows. What were your favorite shows from that night and from around Seoul?
I think from around that area, I must say I really enjoyed the survey on Asian women artists. Connecting Bodies, Asian Women Artists at the MMCA. I think for me, as an Asian woman growing up in Asia, seeing that exhibition, it felt quite emotional, but at the same time, I'm so glad that these Asian women artists, they are featured, they're given a stage to present their works, and also educating a younger audience about, the history. There are big names, of course, like Kusama, Yoko Ono, those are the names that people all know about already. But then there are other names from other countries and regions that people might not be familiar with. And even for people from Asia, it's a very important show. I think it's the beginning of something that's worth more attention and discussion. And I hope that a show like that can travel to some other places beyond Asia.
I'm so glad you highlight that show because, it's super ambitious, right? It was like more than 60 artists. It was multi-generational. It was from countries throughout Asia. And you saw this thread of women artists and feminism, I think, throughout a lot of the exhibitions. Because also at the Seoul Museum of Art, they were doing a big centennial for Chun Kyung-ja, this sort of amazing 20th century painter from Korea. Kim In-soon had a room exhibition to herself, an amazing feminist artist. And then there's also a new book that you were telling me about, published by Phaidon by the art historian Kim Hong-hee, which is all focused on Korean feminist artists, right?
Yeah, I think the focus will continue in London during Frieze Week.
Yes. We should touch on that, too. I mean, the sort of Korean wave is crashing into London later on. But let's delve into the fairs. Because you hit the ground early, you were able to make it to an event I love, but I didn't make it this year, which is the Preview Fair. And then you made it to the big ones later on. So what was your take on the market and what was happening?
I didn't know about it until my friends told me about it. And they was like, hey, you have to go to this one. It's closest before the fair opens. I'm like, what? I just went, just like a few hours before they closed. And I just managed. It was a very busy beginning of the week, with all these events and the Paradise City party that I would like to talk about. But we'll come back to that. The preview fair is actually quite nicely put together. And of course, don't expect multi-million-dollar works. I mean, it's not about that. It's about emerging artists and emerging galleries. But I think overall, everybody could feel that, okay, the market is kind of slow. So I think people have kind of managed their own expectations. But then I think some artists, they did pretty well at the preview fair. Like, for example, Park Jae-hoon, who's based between Amsterdam and Seoul, his works really got quite a lot of attention and they were close to the entrance. Of course, a very good spot to showcase the works. And then there's also this young artist, Lee Sung-hoon, and they're very interesting, very cute, little colorful, small works. They are drawings, but then drawings on these acrylic panels that are stacked together. And it was the only artist I saw with all the red dots on the label. So they're all sold out. And I know that some dealers who have different kind of exposure, they have already approached the artist to maybe develop something beyond the emerging level. So I think that's quite exciting to see.
Totally. It's sort of like a NADA event almost. It's like you see amazing art, you see horrible art, you see galleries that are just super young. And then it becomes a kind of a proving ground or a platform to move on to maybe a bigger gallery or a broader profile.
Yeah, definitely. And before the preview, then of course, I think quite a few museum openings. At Liam, we saw each other for like 5 seconds.
Liam was fantastic. One of the talks of the town, I think, was the show that Rikwatir Vanija curated. Annika Yi also had a pretty incredible presentation of new work. What did you think of Liam? What were your takeaways?
I think Liam has always been a major highlight, especially at the beginning of the art week. Rikwatir's show, I think it was a delightful surprise to a lot of people. I think they were just very excited to see how the show was installed and all those different rooms, how they are arranged in a way that you're discovering something new, one room after another. It was just a nice end of the evening, like before you go off for dinner.
Yes, agreed. And so for the uninitiated, it's essentially the Samsung Family's Museum, very remarkable architecture. 3 star architects designed it. It's Mario Bota, Nouvelle, and Koolhaas. And it's where, the big show of the week always is. So Annika had this kind of incredible survey of really her whole practice, from the kind of early tempera flowers to these new, super ambitious, kind of glowing, kinetic things. The real surprise was whoa, this show that Liam does every 2 years called Art Spectrum, which always focuses on young Korean artists. They brought Rikwatir Vanija in. And it was this sort of how would you describe it? It was like a haunted house, essentially, where you kind of go down these corridors and you open rooms and there's a video playing, or one room it was turned into a bar and there was a band playing. It was just one thing after another. I mean, Ji-hyun Jung had a climbing wall set up that went 50 feet tall that I attempted to do and fell very quickly, although someone did make it all the way up. Priscilla Jung, this great New York artist, had this kind of incredible giant black cylindrical sculpture sitting in this very strange way in the kind of lobby of the home. So, that was great to see. And I thought an interesting counterpoint to, I know you went to Elmgrim and Dragset, which was another house and sort of haunted in some ways.
Yes, I've seen some reviews and I think that everybody had different take. But I think for an exhibition of this scale happening in Asia, I don't think it happens often. I think it's a wonderful opportunity to present an exhibition like this to an audience in Asia. It's a museum show, so it's open to public. I mean, not everyone can afford to travel like most people from the art industry do. So I hope that people can go see it if they can, because it's really worth visiting.
Totally. Super ambitious show. There's this designer house that Elmgren and Dragset have set up. There's a pool. And then the highlight for me was the creepy back room where there's a banquet going on and these quite lifelike human beings who I really believed until I almost touched them that they were real. One of the strangest shows I've seen in a long time. But this is maybe a nice segue into the fairs, because What was interesting to me about Mori Pacific was Gagosian had set up, so they have the museum downstairs. It's a beautiful David Chipperfield designed building. It's the headquarters for this beauty giant, which is just a total force in K-beauty. And then on the ground floor, Gagosian had set up a Derek Adams show themed around Black hair salons, nail salons, beauty, and seemed to have done a pretty big opening the night before. That felt like a big market moment. They had hired a great director away from Spruth Magers, who'd been based in Seoul, and did that, the night before the fairs. And so you were on the Kiev beat, which is the longtime Korean International Art Fair, gigantic this year, right? Like, was it 250 galleries?
206. So
206. Okay, thank you.
So a bit down from last year's 210. It was very crowded the first few hours. There was this really long queue. I think people were quite surprised, like, wow, there were so many people like so eager to go to see Kiev rather than going up to Frieze. But I think there's some kind of a VIP arrangements there so that Kiev can keep their own VIPs for the first few hours, and then Frieze they keep their own VIPs for the first few hours until the afternoon so that they can go to like visit each other's fair, which I think is a fair kind of arrangement. Walking around Kiev is big because they have like more than 200 galleries, but then it also has a very diverse mix. So you can see some works that are selling, they have a much higher price point, like Sundaram Tagore sold a work for $420,000. So that's a very high price point compared to other works. And then you have some other galleries selling works that are priced for just a few $100s. So it's a very diverse range, but obviously you have a lot more Korean galleries than international galleries. And I could also see that some international galleries are trying to break into the Korean market, and it's probably like their first stop in trying to, test the water and see if there's a market for the kind of works that they're presenting. But the overall sales, according to the galleries I spoke to, they felt a bit slow this year.
Yeah, there was a similar vibe at Frieze. I mean, people were doing business, but it wasn't the bull market days that may have existed at one point. One thing I was told was from a blue chip dealer said, it used to be that we would send out the PDF and we would ink a lot of stuff in advance. Now they're coming the day of. Collectors are coming the day of, and they're making purchases, but it wasn't stuff flying off the rack. And you pointed out also that the culture is just a little bit different around collecting. There's less of the mad rush to go. I mean, people work during the day. I mean, you hear this in some places in Europe as well. Like, they don't want to take the day off necessarily to go to the fair. And so I was back there on Saturday, and dealers seemed happy. I mean, they'd been, I think, making steady sales. Again, it wasn't gigantic. Stuff was moving. And yeah, Frieze Seoul is an interesting fair working with Kiev, because I always love going to Kiev because you just see so much Korean art. It's wild. The vast majority of dealers are coming from Korea, and when do you have an opportunity to just see that grouping of young and old and modern and contemporary? And then you go up to Frieze Seoul, and I think they said 60% of the galleries have a Asian presence, which is kind of a loose term nowadays, since so many of these large galleries do have a Hong Kong branch or a Seoul branch. But it did feel like a nice cross-section of both Asia. There were some strong Korean presentations, and then, of course, an international grouping. I liked a lot of what I saw at Frieze Seoul. Like, I was really happy to see Gallery Schille there, which is a Daegu-based gallery, which now actually has 3 galleries in Seoul as well. They showed 2 really kind of canonical but sort of undersung Korean artists, Kim Young-jin, who people may have seen in the Guggenheim and Hammer show of experimental art from the 60s and 70s in Korea, and then Hoon Kwak, who's a kind of amazing abstract painter. Lots of great stuff. There was a beautiful Henry Taylor painting at Hauser and Wirth that sold. So things were happening, and I enjoyed myself. It was just such a great week with everything going on.
I'm glad that you enjoyed yourself. I think most people had a great time too. If you are into seeing art and meeting people, it was definitely a great occasion to meet people from other parts of the world. You have all these different regions, so they have their own events. Later on, that would be like Japan, for the Art Week Tokyo and ACK. And then January, you have Singapore. And then March, you have Hong Kong. And then November, you have Shanghai. It's a very good mix of different kind of centers with different kind of focus, serving different levels of clientele and different tastes of collecting. It feels like, okay, now it's much more vibrant across Asia.
One interesting theme that I saw throughout, and I think you noticed this when we were doing the previews for the fairs and everything happening in the city, was all of this collaboration. I mean, across Asia, but also across the diaspora. I mean, Gallery Hyundai, they have two really great, wonderful spaces up in Samcheong. They had Commonwealth and Council, the kind of amazing Los Angeles young gallery, to curate a show for them. Swiss gallery, even Pressenhuber, had worked with P21 to set up a space in Itaewon. They were showing Sam Falls, the great, now LA-based artist, used to be in New York. And you also wrote about the show at Whistle, which is another gallery in Itaewon, which was incredible, and they had a collaboration.
Yes, with Misako and Ronson and Raw Projects from Jakarta and Cao Milang from Hong Kong. I went to see the show. It was really like works by different artists represented by different galleries that all quite nicely curated and put together in one group show. I think it's a very nice collaboration to see among galleries from Asia, and they are trying to explore a new kind of model. And I know Misako and Ronson and Raw Projects, maybe it's just Raw now, ROH, but they're doing a show in Singapore like later on this month. I think we're seeing more of this kind of collaborative model happening, like not necessarily international, but just across the region. I think it's something that is healthy and is also very exciting.
Totally. I'm so glad you mentioned that show because, yeah, it was awesome. It really did look like a proper, exciting exhibition of young artists. And for me, yeah, the highlights of the gallery shows, especially on the younger end, were that. At P21, I loved Kim Ji-young. I'm going to encourage everyone also to Google Minook Lim at BB&M, an older Korean artist, but she's just incredible. These kind of amazing spectral paintings, as well as there was a sculptural installation. Very strange, very different than other things I saw. Before we pivot away from Seoul, because the whole Korean peninsula was basically lit up during this 2-week stretch, any other shows that you thought were great? We should also mention Pace had just blowout show. Rothko, Leo Fan. Rothko got a floor, Leo Fan got a floor. That was just like a show of absolute power. Arnie Glimcher was there. The Rothko family was there. What were other highlights for you? Anything else to shout out?
The Paradise Art Night.
Yes.
That's something that I think we need to talk about.
We need to unpack the casino resort, yeah.
So Paradise City, for people who are not familiar with the geographic location, so Paradise City is a bit further from Seoul, or it's actually closer to the airport.
Right, it's basically at the airport.
Yeah.
You can walk to the airport from there. It's quite a trip by taxi if you're going from Seoul.
Well, that was like, an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And so you spend, an hour and a half to get there, first of all. Last year, it was a Sotheby's party, but this year is completely different. There was an exhibition called Wonder by George Sperling. And then there was a preview of an auction that's like jointly organized by Vera Williams, Jupiter, and G-Dragon, K-pop star and art collector. And then an after party. It was a total nightmare.
I mean, that is just raw power in a room. That's inferno.
Yeah, but then the problem is it was almost impossible to get into either of them. They stop people from entering, even though you have your invitation. I was walking down the corridor, and then at one point, I just got pushed to the side by a security guard, like not knowing what was going on because there's some K-pop celebrity like entering the space. I'm like, why'd you all push me to the side of the room?
Oh that my was gosh.
That was, I was like, whoa, okay, calm down. Like, so that's one thing. But then it was also the night of celebrity sighting. A lot of people are very excited to see those celebrities, including myself.
So just a huge turnout from, K-pop world, the drama world in Korea. That's where you had Pharrell as well and Cause. So it was just hitting on all cylinders, it sounded like.
Yeah, I was with a few friends and they all like screamed, actually like quietly, but like, whoa! Oh, it was the Itaewon class star Park Se-jun. They were all so excited about his entrance. There was also Lee Min-ho. I've watched many of his shows. It was a tiring night, but it was also a fun night.
You're brave for doing it. I wish that I had touched down earlier and gone. Pusha T performed, right? I'm a big Pusha T fan, and I'm jealous that you got to see that.
Yeah, it was a great performance.
Nice. The final thing I would just plug about Paradise City is if people go, or if they're just visiting Korea, they have a branch of Imperial Treasure chain of Cantonese restaurants, and they're so over the top, they're ridiculous, but the food is so good. They do this Peking duck, and then after you finish, they'll take the bones and the leftover meat and they fry it with just like salt and pepper. And then you can just, eat it off the bone. Delicious. Amazing. So yeah, Paradise City is really, there's no place like it. It's filled with art. It's a casino. It's a resort. But it sounds like they need to do better party management and crowd management.
Well, that was eye-opening. That's all I'm going to say.
About what can happen. So that's probably the perfect pivot from the most luxurious, over-the-top, celebrity-filled party to then the Gwangju Biennale, which has a kind of rich tradition of rigorous curatorial projects. Gwangju is very much not Seoul. For people who are unfamiliar, it's a city of about 1.5 million. Historically, it's been a hotbed of left-wing activism. In 1980, there was an uprising against the authoritarian government in Gwangju, and the people there really played a heroic role. The biennial comes out of that. It's a kind of memorial in some way to the spirit of Gwangju. It opens in 1995. Nam June Pak is involved in its founding. The initial edition attracts 1 million people as visitors, and since then it's had just remarkable curators. Massimiliano Gioni did a very famous edition before going on to curate the Venice Biennale. And this year, for the 15th edition, the 30th anniversary, they have Nicolas Borriaud, who listeners may know as the founder of the term relational aesthetics, a big booster of figures like Rikrit Tiravanica, who we mentioned earlier, Pierre Wieg, Karsten Haller, and people like that. And it is a wildly ambitious show. And you were on the ground with our colleague Kathy Fan, who can't be here, who's on vacation, but people should tune into Artnet China to read her coverage. But Vivienne, what did you think of the big show, and what can you tell people? I mean, it's the whole Gwangju situation was wild this year.
The show this year is so much bigger because it's not just the main exhibition at the exhibition hall. I mean, that already spans, 5 galleries. And then you have these other locations across the city. One major thing to pay attention to is the pavilion. So they have 31 pavilions this year. So most of them are national pavilions, and then some of them are kind of in collaborative models. It feels like Gwangju is like trying to be Venice in Asia, which was something that I already wrote about last time for the last edition of the Gwangju Biennale when they announced the coming edition, which is like this edition, the number of pavilions will go up from 9 to 20. That's what they said last year, and they outdid themselves by having 31 pavilions. Obviously, you can see how ambitious they're trying to be. The ones that I saw, I really like them. Like, for example, the Southeast Asian pavilions, the Japanese pavilion, and also the American pavilion, which is represented by the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco, having Asian Americans to represent America in Gwangju. That's a big statement to make. What do you think about it, Andrew? Because it's a nice show. But is it a major anniversary exhibition?
You had this point that, the previous edition, it kind of engaged with the history of Gwangju, it engaged with Korean art history in a more rigorous or accessible way. This show is tough, I think, in some ways. It's a very different biennial than some we've seen recently. I saw one international curator there, and they told me, I think a lot of people are going to hate this show. The full title is Pansori, a Soundscape of the 21st Century. Pansori being a traditional form of music that dates back to 17th century Korea, to the Joseon dynasty. It's traditionally one singer, a drummer. It has a narrative element. The belief is that it came from either shaman traditions or street performers. And so Borriaud takes this and he says, I have a quote here. He says he wants this to be an operatic exhibition about the space we live in. And then he also says that he translates pansori as the noise from the public space, which he says could be understood as the voice of the subalterns. And so he kind of takes this very specific discipline and says, we can encapsulate all sorts of figures. It's a very noisy show, and it's very much a show about how people are responding to climate change, different ecological crises, political crises. You see people grappling in, I think, really rigorous ways with tough issues. There was a lot of skepticism among the local audience about what this had to do with pansori. There was this kind of sensibility of maybe someone parachuting in a little bit and taking a little license about what that could mean.
Yeah, that's what I heard from Korean friends. I think they appreciate the effort, but at the same time, they're also a bit skeptical about the kind of interpretation.
Yeah. What were highlights for you from the show? Was there anything that stuck with you? Any particular works?
There were a lot of big installations in the show, in the main exhibitions. But then I got very intrigued by the selection of paintings.
Well, that's very interesting to me because I will say I loved a lot of the installation work. One artist I loved was Mimi Park, who is based in New York, had a show at Sebastian Gladstone semi-recently in Los Angeles, and she did this kind of amazing installation with glitter scattered all around. There's a very, very small sculpture of it looks like a child. There's kind of these earth elements, it's very explosive, chaotic. I personally thought the paintings were very weak throughout the show. I thought it was the classic sort of example of European theoretical curator, very strong sculpturally, some incisive video work. I didn't like the painting, but what struck you about the painting?
Compared to all these very elaborate installations, the paintings became a very odd existence among all of them.
I totally agree with you. There were great, great, great sculptures, I thought. An artist who was somewhat new to me, I'd only seen in photos, Mira Mann, also a sculptor. They had a great piece, that kind of long mirror piece along the ground floor with all sorts of strange objects. Mira Mann also took over this abandoned house in a neighborhood about, 20 minutes away by car, Yongnim, which was a very beautiful but strange spectral installation with a few videos, at least one of which was playing pansori. There was a room covered in paper, which Mira Mann had set up with a traditional ink brush, and you could kind of brush ink around, but it felt very haunted. So yeah, I'm with you. It's the sculpture was very strong. The painting, I'm not so sure about.
Yeah, Mira Mann, I think that really made an impression. I think both that installation in the exhibition hall and the abandoned house.
On the subject of Mira Mann, since we're in agreement on their work, credit to Borriaud for, this was not a list of superstar artists. A show of this scale, you could tap really famous artists. You could say, I want to bring back all of my old buddies from the relational aesthetics days. There were some known names, but he really tapped Mira Mann, very much a newer person to the international stage. That was really refreshing to see. If you go to Korea in the next couple months, you got to make your way down to Gwangju because there is just so much happening. It's totally exciting. And it's amazing to see just what a pivotal role the Biennale and art plays in the community there. There's also a branch of the National Museum. There's a dedicated art museum. There are a few project spaces around town, 32 national pavilions, the Biennale, this other show. You could go down and spend a week there, I think, and not see everything.
Yeah, totally. And Andrew, you went to Busan.
And that was the final stop.
I didn't make it, so how was it?
Final stop was Busan, which is sort of the second city in Korea. It is along the southern coast, about 3.5 million people, beautiful beaches, seafood. I mean, Korea itself is a very biennial mad place. There are biennials in all sorts of towns and cities and rivers. And Busan is one of the most well-regarded, has a long kind of august history of tapping just very interesting curators. This time, the exhibition was called Seeing in the Dark. The curators were Vera May, who's curated widely. Philippe Pirotte was co-curator. He used to be at the Stadelschule in Frankfurt. They tapped about 62 artists. In some ways, there was overlap with Gwangju. I mean, something that came up frequently was folks saying that it reminded them of the most recent Documenta. There were a couple artists who overlapped. Funnily enough, it's a show that I think could have worked in Gwangju in the sense that it was very politically engaged. And I should say, the Busan Biennale takes part mostly at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Busan, which is an amazing place. It's on this island in a bird estuary, very beautiful, tranquil place, gigantic museum. One of the big installations was photographs by a photographer named So Young-gyeol, who has done incredible work just documenting labor protests throughout Korea, which if anyone has seen one of these, I mean, the sort of activism and the street demonstrations they do are just something else. And so Hong Jin-hwan has taken these photographs and installed them at very large scale in one of the sections at the museum. There's also a film about sort of the politics of protesting versus the politics of going to vote, of being engaged through normal channels, which I think really resonates with things happening in the US, throughout the world right now, how you make a difference. The themes are pretty wild, I should say, though, to back up a little bit in the Busan show. The two main ones are pirates as well as Buddhist enlightenment. And there's a sort of very involved theoretical thing, which I can only sort of sketch out quickly on the podcast, but they look to the anarchist anthropologist David Graeber, who passed away a few years ago, a well-regarded figure who was involved in Occupy Wall Street. And he wrote about how the kind of pirate culture that existed, pirate utopias is a term that he used, in some ways kind of led the way toward enlightenment and democracy. And then at the same time, they were looking at how you pursue Buddhist enlightenment. And so there were these threads of pirates in the show. At one of the ancillary locations, there were 3 kind of auxiliary locations, one of which was a kind of old bank vault, which is now part of the Contemporary History Museum in Busan. And this local street artist who goes by the name K2 had taken portraits of former Korean presidents and used graffiti to turn them into pirates, like in the classical sense that you would picture with like the bandanas and the pirate earrings. The show is, in some sense, it felt a little all over the place in a fun way in some ways. And I should say a very international cast, also like Gwangju, not big names. Some Korean big names, but not like international superstars. So you had from Korea this amazing feminist artist named Yoon Suk-nam, who has done these portraits for many, many years now of historical activists, many of whom opposed Japanese colonialism during that era in Korea. Also, I would say pretty sculptural heavy, pretty installation heavy. Also a strong sound component, which was really interesting to see. I mean, I'm seeing a recurring thread. So Seoul, we had Rikrit Tiravanija with a sort of haunted house. We had Elm Green, a drag set with the house. Gwangju, we had Miraman taking over this abandoned house. Also in Busan, one of the locations was this old house in the downtown area, kind of tucked away among all of the what you would think of as the stereotypical Korean apartment building. And there were some great sculptures in there by Eugene Jung, a younger Korean artist. These kind of dystopian, fractured, it looks like a kind of like globe of the world, or maybe like a utopian sculpture of a globe had shattered apart and they were sitting on the balcony of this old mansion. So there was this sense of, in Busan, I guess to sum it up, an activist spirit. I think it was a bit more hopeful than Gwangju, a bit more like engaged, while at the same time, this kind of like playful element with pirates and being playful with culture and tweaking cultural artifacts.
I think Busan is just an interesting city itself along the coast, and of course all these very interesting histories about the Korean peninsula is worth visiting. And Busan has already made a name in the creative world. They have their own art fairs and also the Busan Film Festival that is now Asia's biggest film festival. I wish I could go maybe another time.
Totally. Well, yeah, and you saw it last year, and everyone should go back and read your piece from last year because you had a good kind of overview of what it means in the city and how it engages with the different histories. It's a fascinating place. This can be a seg here, last edition. Mira Lee had just this kind of mind-blowing installation, which then got partially destroyed by a typhoon. She let it be that way. But now Mira Lee is going to be at Tate Modern come October. And so the sort of Korean wave, which we've been seeing, is going to be a big presence coming up on your home turf, Vivienne.
Yeah, I think this is really exciting. I'm just looking at the lineup, really looking forward to see what she comes up with at the Tate Modern at the Turbine Hall Commission. And Haega Yang, she's having a solo show at Hayward, also around the same time. And then there are also a number of galleries showing not just Korean artists, but also Asian artists, younger artists, and there should be a distinctive presence at the Frieze Fairs as well. So yeah, the Korean wave continues.
It's kind of incredible. And I noticed there were a lot of museum people on the ground is something that struck me. There seems like there's such interest. And so for even the Korean government, which has really made pushing culture an important part of their diplomatic strategy, I mean, it's paying off. We're seeing it all over, and it's fascinating to see.
Absolutely. I've spoken to some galleries, like after the fairs. I think everybody said something quite similar. So it's not just about the sales, but it's also about like how getting into the Korean scene and doing business there, especially for galleries coming out from overseas, not just Western galleries, but also other Asian galleries outside of Korea, is quite tricky.
Yeah, I think that's true. Something that struck me was when I was living in Korea, I saw a number of Western dealers come through, and their colleagues were opening spaces, their colleagues were doing frees, and they wanted to kind of get the lay of the land. And my sense is that the people who did well, who were successful coming from abroad, they came in advance. They made sure to meet local people, to spend time with the institutions. I mean, really to partner up with a local art advisor, to make sure you find a great interpreter, to find advisors that have clients who are interested in your kind of work so that you can make sure that you're showing your work to the right people. It's still an open question, Korea. It's still not a gigantic market. There's a lot of interest. People come and have a great time. May 36 had a pop-up. In previous editions, we've seen galleries like Kordansky had a pop-up one year. There are things happening and people are trying it out. And I think now it's going to be looking forward the next few years if it sticks, if people hang around, and how sustainable it ends up being.
It's also worth noting the turnover of the galleries at both fairs. How many of them are returning and how many of them are new? I mean, it seems like they have quite a lot of new galleries like every year, but then the total number is down. So I guess that tells us something about the market and the challenges of getting into this market.
Exactly. Yeah, it's interesting for people to note the churn at like Kia, that, some people came to town, tried it out, and it maybe wasn't for them, and we'll see what happens. That might be the perfect moment to end on it. A kind of question mark for the future, a lot of excitement, looking back at the past few weeks and these shows that are still up, so everyone should get to Korea. And then people should get to London to see the Korean wave and just the great Asian presence that you'll be writing about in the coming weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that there will be a dialogue between East and West. And that's something that I'm particularly interested in, obviously. So yeah, next stop, London.
Excellent. I look forward to it.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Carolyn Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.